Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've been a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky for 26 years. At 61, I should be thinking about retirement. Maybe a small cabin somewhere with better cell phone reception and fewer tourists asking if the caves are really that deep. Instead, I'm writing this account because some stories need to be told, even if no one will believe them. The events I'm about to describe took place during the government shutdown of 2024, when our skeleton crew was tasked with maintaining essential operations at what is officially the world's longest known cave system. What we discovered in those empty tunnels beneath the Kentucky hills changed everything I thought I knew about the darkness that lies beneath our feet. I grew up in Bowling Green, just 30 miles from the cave entrance, the son of a coal miner who'd spent his life in underground darkness. My father used to tell me stories about things that lived in the deep places. Not the usual mining folklore about Tommyknockers and cave-ins, but older stories passed down from his grandfather, who'd worked these same limestone hills in the 1800s. Stories about sections of cave where miners would refuse to go, where their carbide lamps would flicker and die for no reason, where the darkness itself seemed to move with purpose and intelligence. I'd dismissed those stories as superstition until I became a cave guide myself, leading tourist groups through the well-lit sections of Mammoth Cave's 400-mile mapped tunnel system. But even in those early years, I noticed things that didn't make it into the official park literature, cold spots that had no meteorological explanation, sections where electronic equipment would malfunction, places where visitors would become inexplicably anxious, hurrying through passages that looked identical to dozens of others. The caves had moods, and I learned to read them the way my father had read coal seams, watching for subtle signs that indicated when it was safe to go deeper and when it was better to stay near the surface. I became a full park ranger in 1998, specializing in cave rescue and the maintenance of the park's extensive underground infrastructure. Mammoth Cave isn't just a natural wonder. It's a complex system of walkways, lighting, and safety equipment that allows hundreds of thousands of visitors each year to experience a tiny fraction of the cave's true extent. Most tourists see maybe 2 miles of tunnel during their visit. The rest, hundreds of miles of unmapped passages, remains unexplored, officially too dangerous or too difficult to access. That's where my story really begins. During the 2024 government shutdown, our staff was reduced to just 3 rangers. Myself, Janet Reeves, a 38-year-old specialist in cave ecology, and Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old recent hire from Montana who'd transferred from Glacier National Park. Our job was to maintain basic security and ensure that the cave's critical infrastructure, ventilation systems, emergency lighting, geological monitoring equipment, continued functioning despite the lack of federal funding. What we weren't supposed to do was conduct any exploratory activities or venture into unmapped sections of the cave system. But when our seismic monitoring equipment began registering unusual activity deep beneath the park, we had to investigate. The readings suggested structural changes in areas of the cave that had been stable for decades, potentially indicating new collapses or the opening of previously unknown passages. Janet was the first to notice the anomalies. She'd been monitoring the cave's ecosystem for signs of white nose syndrome, the fungal disease that had devastated bat populations throughout the eastern United States. But her acoustic monitoring equipment, designed to track bat activity, had begun recording sounds from areas where no bats were known to roost. "Listen to this," she said, playing back a recording from sensors placed deep in the cave's Violet City section. "The frequency is all wrong for bats. It's too low, too regular, almost like breathing." Marcus finished, adjusting his headphones. Something big, breathing very slowly. The sound was unsettling, a deep, rhythmic whoosh that repeated every 30 to 40 seconds. It wasn't mechanical. We checked all the ventilation equipment. It wasn't geological. Limestone doesn't breathe. but it was definitely coming from somewhere deep in the unmapped sections of the cave, from passages that official surveys claimed didn't exist. Against protocol, we decided to investigate. We entered the cave system through the historic entrance on a Tuesday morning in January, when the winter closure meant no tourists would be around to complicate our mission. The plan was simple: follow the established trails to Violet City, then use the maintenance passages to access the areas where Janet's equipment had detected the anomalous sounds. Mammoth Cave in winter is a different place than the tourist destination most people know. The artificial lighting is reduced to emergency levels, casting strange shadows on limestone walls that have been carved by water over millions of years. Our headlamps created pools of light that seemed to shrink the vast chambers into intimate, claustrophobic spaces. But it was the silence that got to me. The absolute, profound quiet that exists only in deep places where sound has nowhere to go. We reached Violet City after 2 hours of hiking through familiar passages. Violet City isn't actually a city, of course, but a large chamber named for the purplish flowstone formations that decorate its walls. It's a popular stop on tourist routes, known for its excellent acoustics and the Echo River that flows through a channel carved deep into the chamber floor. But something was wrong with the acoustics. Normal speech, which should have echoed clearly in the chamber's acoustic environment, seemed muffled and distorted. Our voices fell dead in the air, as if the limestone walls were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. Even stranger, our footsteps produced no echo at all, despite the chamber's reputation for pristine sound reflection. The air pressure is different too, Janet observed, checking her instruments. Lower than normal, like we're at a higher altitude than we should be. Marcus was studying the geological survey maps, trying to correlate them with Janet's acoustic data. According to this, the sounds are coming from about a quarter-mile northwest of here, but there shouldn't be any passages in that direction. The limestone formation ends, and there's supposed to be solid bedrock. That's when we noticed the new opening. It was tucked behind a flowstone formation that I'd walked past hundreds of times during guided tours. A narrow crack in the limestone wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, that definitely hadn't been there the last time I'd conducted maintenance in this section. The edges of the opening were smooth, as if they'd been carved rather than broken, and cool air flowed from the gap with a subtle current that carried unfamiliar scents: ozone, mineral salts, and something organic that I couldn't identify. Recent geological activity could have opened a new passage, Janet suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. The seismic readings we've been getting might indicate ongoing structural changes in this area. I knelt beside the opening and shined my flashlight into the gap. The beam disappeared into absolute darkness, revealing a passage that extended farther than my light could reach. But what caught my attention was the air movement, a steady, rhythmic flow that matched the timing of the breathing sounds Janet had recorded. "We should report this to the Park Service," Marcus said. "Get a proper survey team out here, follow official protocols." He was right, of course. Protocol dictated that we map and assess any new cave openings before exploration, ensuring proper safety measures and environmental protections. But we were operating with a skeleton crew during a government shutdown, and by the time we could get approval for a formal survey, the political situation might have changed. This could be a significant geological discovery, potentially adding miles to the known cave system. Or it could be something else entirely. I made the decision that would haunt the rest of my life. I squeezed through the opening. The passage beyond was unlike anything in the mapped sections of Mammoth Cave. Instead of the rough, water-carved limestone typical of the cave system, these walls were smooth and regular, as if they'd been shaped by some purposeful intelligence. The floor was level and clear of the usual debris, fallen rocks, bat guano, mineral deposits that accumulated in natural cave formations. More unsettling was the way our lights behaved in this passage. Our LED headlamps, which should have illuminated the walls clearly, seemed to produce a dimmer glow, as if the darkness itself was absorbing photons. We had to move closer to objects to see them clearly, creating an effect like walking through thick fog despite the clear air. Janet and Marcus followed reluctantly, and we began exploring the new passage system. It extended much farther than any of us had expected, branching into side passages and chambers that showed no signs of water erosion or natural limestone cave formation. The walls were covered with a thin, dark substance that looked almost like soot, but felt smooth and slightly warm to the touch. "This isn't natural limestone cave formation," Janet observed, taking samples of the wall substance. "The geology is all wrong. These passages were carved, not eroded." "Carved by what?" Marcus asked, and that was the question none of us wanted to answer. The breathing sounds were getting stronger as we went deeper, and we began to notice other acoustic anomalies. Our voices carried differently in these tunnels, sometimes seeming to echo from directions that made no geometric sense, other times being swallowed completely by the strange darkness. Occasionally, we would hear what sounded like our own voices speaking words we hadn't said, coming from passages we hadn't explored. After what felt like hours of exploration, we reached a chamber that defied everything I thought I knew about cave systems. The space was enormous, larger than any natural chamber in the mapped portions of Mammoth Cave. But instead of the irregular walls and ceiling typical of limestone caverns, this chamber was perfectly spherical, with walls that curved away into darkness beyond the reach of our lights. The floor was smooth and level, covered with the same dark substance we'd encountered in the passages. But here it seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence that was visible only when we turned off our headlamps. In the center of the chamber stood something that shouldn't have existed. It looked like a tree, but made of the same dark material as the walls. A twisted, branching structure that rose from the chamber floor and disappeared into the darkness above. But as we approached, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was more like a massive nervous system, with branching pathways that pulsed with faint electrical activity, carrying signals between different parts of the structure in patterns too complex to follow. And it was breathing. The entire structure expanded and contracted in the slow, regular rhythm Janet had recorded on her acoustic equipment. With each breath, the bioluminescent patterns on the chamber walls would brighten and fade, as if the entire space was connected to some vast circulatory system. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. "What is it?" Janet was taking readings with every instrument she had, but the results made no sense. The structure registered as organic on her biological sensors, but composed of minerals that shouldn't exist in nature. It was generating electromagnetic fields that interfered with our electronic equipment, and the temperature around it fluctuated in patterns that seemed to respond to our presence. "It's aware of us," Janet said quietly. "The electromagnetic activity spikes whenever we move closer, and the breathing pattern changes when we speak. This thing is reacting to our presence." That's when I noticed we weren't alone in the chamber. At first, they looked like shadows, dark shapes that moved along the walls and ceiling of the spherical space. But as my eyes adjusted to the strange lighting conditions, I could see that they were more substantial than shadows. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong in proportion, with elongated limbs and movements that flowed like liquid rather than following normal biomechanics. They were watching us. "Don't move suddenly," I warned the others. "Whatever these things are, they're studying us as much as we're studying them." The shadow figures began to descend from the walls, moving with a grace that suggested they were as comfortable on vertical surfaces as on the chamber floor. As they came closer, I could see that they weren't entirely solid. Their forms seemed to shift and flow, sometimes appearing almost human, other times becoming something that hurt to look at directly. One of them approached me, stopping just outside the range of my headlamp. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from inside my head rather than through my ears. "You are the warden of the surface places," it said, and somehow I understood that it was referring to my role as a park ranger. "You maintain the barriers between the deep places and the bright world above, but the barriers are failing." I tried to respond, but found that I could communicate with it through thought rather than speech. The connection was disorienting, like having someone else's memories suddenly become available alongside my own. Through that mental link, I began to understand what I was seeing. The chamber wasn't just a geological formation. It was a node in a vast underground network that extended far beyond the known cave system. The tree-like structure was a kind of biological computer, processing information from sensors located throughout the limestone caves and communicating with similar nodes in cave systems around the world. The shadow beings weren't monsters or cave-dwelling primitives. They were gardeners, maintaining a planetary monitoring system that had been operating for millions of years, keeping track of geological changes, climate patterns, and the activities of surface-dwelling life forms. Your species is disrupting the deep systems, the shadow being explained. The vibrations from your machines, the chemicals from your industries, the heat from your energy consumption. It's all affecting the balance we've maintained since before your ancestors learned to make fire. I saw visions through the mental connection, images of similar chambers throughout the world's cave systems, all connected through underground networks that function like a global nervous system. The beings who tended these systems had been monitoring surface life for millennia, occasionally intervening when geological stability was threatened, but generally remaining hidden from human awareness. But human industrial activity was overwhelming their ability to maintain the balance. Climate change was altering underground water systems, affecting the delicate conditions required for their technology to function. Mining and drilling operations were damaging critical nodes in their network. The breathing sounds Janet had detected were symptoms of a system under stress, struggling to adapt to changes happening too quickly for geological time responses. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked through the mental link. "Because your role makes you a potential liaison," the being replied. "You understand both the surface world and the deep places. You could help us establish communication with your kind before the damage becomes irreversible." The other shadow beings began moving around the chamber, tending to various aspects of the central structure. I watched them work, noticing that their movements were precisely coordinated, as if they were all part of a single consciousness distributed across multiple bodies. The central tree structure pulsed with increasing activity as they worked, and the bioluminescent patterns on the walls became more complex. Janet and Marcus were having their own encounters with the shadow beings, receiving information about the underground ecosystem that had existed parallel to surface life for millions of years. The beings showed us how cave systems throughout the world were connected, how they monitored and maintained geological stability, how they had prevented numerous catastrophic events that could have devastated surface life. But they also showed us what would happen if their system failed. Through the mental connection, I experienced visions of earthquakes that would reshape continents, volcanic eruptions that would change global climate, underground water systems collapsing and taking surface rivers and lakes with them. The shadow beings network wasn't just monitoring geological activity, it was actively stabilizing it, preventing the kind of catastrophic changes that had occurred during previous mass extinction events. Human activity was disrupting their ability to maintain that stability. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "Cooperation," the being replied. "Limited access to your surface monitoring systems, so we can coordinate our stabilization efforts with your industrial activities. Recognition that the deep places are inhabited and essential to surface life. Protection for critical nodes like this one from mining and development activities." It seemed reasonable, even essential. But I also understood that revealing the existence of this underground civilization would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of the planet and our place on it. The political, religious, and scientific implications would be staggering. "I need time to think," I said, "to figure out how to present this information in a way that won't cause panic or exploitation." The shadow being seemed to understand. Through the mental connection, I felt its acknowledgement of the complexity of surface-dweller politics and the tendency of human institutions to respond to new discoveries with attempts to control or weaponize them. "Time is a luxury we may not have," it replied. "The destabilization is accelerating. Within your surface timescale, we estimate perhaps 10 of your years before critical failures begin affecting surface conditions." The beings began to withdraw, melting back into the walls and ceiling of the chamber like living shadows. But before the connection was completely severed, the entity I'd been communicating with shared one final piece of information. "There are others of your kind who serve as wardens," it said. rangers and caretakers in other park systems around the world, people who understand the relationship between surface and deep places. You will not be alone in carrying this knowledge. The chamber began to dim as the shadow beings departed, the central structure's breathing slowing to its normal rhythm. Janet, Marcus, and I stood in the fading bioluminescence, trying to process what we'd experienced. "We can't tell anyone about this," Marcus said finally. "Not directly. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what would happen to this place? It would be overrun with scientists, military personnel, people who would see these beings as threats to be neutralized or resources to be exploited." Janet was more practical. "We need to start with small steps, subtle changes to park policies that would protect critical areas without revealing why they need protection. Research initiatives that would give us better understanding of cave systems and their role in geological stability." I realized they were right. My role as a park ranger had prepared me for this responsibility in ways I hadn't understood. I'd spent decades learning to protect wilderness areas from human interference, to balance public access with environmental preservation, to communicate complex ecological concepts to people who often saw nature as just a backdrop for recreation. Now, I had to do the same thing on a scale I'd never imagined. We made our way back through the strange passages to the familiar areas of Mammoth Cave, but everything looked different now. I understood that the limestone formations I'd been guiding tourists through for decades were just the visible portion of something much larger and more complex. Every cave system, every underground river, every deep place where humans feared to go, they were all part of a planetary network that kept our world stable and habitable. And it was our responsibility to protect it. Over the following months, I began implementing subtle changes to park policies. I established new geological sensitivity zones that restricted access to areas near the hidden chamber. I initiated research partnerships with universities studying cave ecosystems and underground hydrology. I became an advocate for expanded cave system protections, speaking at conferences and writing articles about the importance of underground environments to surface ecology. I also began networking with other park rangers and caretakers, sharing information about unusual underground phenomena and identifying others who might be serving similar roles as unwitting liaisons between surface and deep world systems. The shadow being had been right. There were others, scattered throughout park systems around the world. People who had encountered evidence of the underground civilization and were quietly working to protect it. But time is running out. The signs of system destabilization are becoming more obvious to those who know what to look for. Increased seismic activity in areas that should be geologically stable. Changes in underground water systems that affect surface rivers and springs. Unusual acoustic phenomena in cave systems around the world as the underground network struggles to maintain coordination. The shadow beings continue to work, adapting their ancient systems to compensate for the disruptions caused by human industrial activity. But their capacity for adaptation has limits, and we're approaching those limits faster than anyone wants to acknowledge. I'm retiring from the Park Service next month, but not because I'm ready to stop working. I'm transitioning to a new role with a private foundation that studies underground ecosystems and their relationship to surface environment stability. It's a position that will allow me to coordinate more effectively with the other wardens, to build the networks of protection and communication that the shadow beings need to maintain the deep systems. Because I've seen what happens if they fail. In my dreams, I still visit that spherical chamber beneath Mammoth Cave, watching the shadow beings tend their ancient machinery. But now the dreams also show me possible futures, worlds where the underground network has collapsed, where geological stability has failed, where the surface world faces changes that make current climate concerns seem trivial. The shadow beings aren't gods or demons or ancient astronauts. They're gardeners, maintaining the planetary systems that allow surface life to exist. And they need our help to continue that work. Most people will never know they exist, never understand the relationship between the deep places and the bright world above. But a few of us carry the knowledge and the responsibility to protect both worlds. We are the wardens of shadows, guardians of secrets that must be kept even as we work to honor them. And in the darkness beneath our feet, ancient intelligences continue their patient work, breathing life into stone, keeping the world stable for creatures who will never know their names. The caves are still calling, but now I understand what they're saying. They're asking for help, and I've spent the rest of my life learning how to answer. My name is Rachel Moreau, and for the past 19 years, I've been a park ranger at Grand Canyon National Park. At 48, I thought I understood the desert, its moods, its dangers, its ancient secrets carved into layers of red rock that stretch back millions of years. I was wrong about everything. The winter of 2024 changed me in ways I'm still struggling to comprehend. What happened in the remote backcountry near Point Sublime haunts every quiet moment I have. Every time the wind picks up and carries sounds that shouldn't exist. My daughter Emma thinks I should retire, maybe see a therapist. She doesn't understand that some experiences carve themselves so deep into your soul that no amount of talking can excavate them. It started with the budget crisis that hit the National Park Service that year. Sequestration had gutted our funding, and the Grand Canyon was operating with half the staff we needed. When reports came in about strange acoustic phenomena in the North Rim backcountry, most of the senior rangers dismissed them as tourist imagination, or natural wind patterns in the canyon's complex geology. But I couldn't let it go. Maybe it was because I'd grown up here, the daughter of a Hopi mother and a French geologist father, listening to stories about places where the earth remembers things better left forgotten. The reports were scattered but consistent. Hikers camping in remote areas reported hearing voices echoing from deep within the canyon. Not human voices exactly, but something that used human speech patterns to communicate thoughts no human mind could contain. Some described hearing their own voices calling to them from impossible distances, saying things they'd never said, words in languages they didn't recognize. The most disturbing report came from Dr. James Morrison, a geology professor from Northern Arizona University, who'd been conducting research on the North Rim's limestone formations. He'd been camping alone near Thunder River when he heard what he described as the canyon talking to itself. According to his statement, the voices grew louder each night until he could make out distinct conversations echoing from multiple points throughout the canyon system. Hundreds of voices speaking in perfect unison, then fragmenting into chaotic, overlapping dialogues that made his ears bleed. Morrison was found 3 days later by a helicopter search team, wandering along the South Rim with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His research equipment was never recovered, and he'd lost 40 pounds in the 3 days he'd been missing. When park medical staff examined him, they found his eardrums had been damaged by exposure to sounds at frequencies that shouldn't exist in nature. That's when Superintendent Williams assigned me to investigate. I had a reputation for handling the weird cases, the ones that fell into the gray area between natural phenomena and something else entirely. Maybe it was my mixed heritage that made me comfortable with ambiguity, with the possibility that the scientific worldview I'd been educated in didn't encompass everything the desert had to offer. I planned a 5-day solo camping trip to the area where Morrison had been conducting his research. Solo trips weren't standard protocol, but we were understaffed, and I'd been exploring the Grand Canyon's backcountry since I was a teenager. I knew the terrain, the weather patterns, the locations of reliable water sources. Or I thought I did. I drove out to Point Sublime on a Thursday morning in late February, the North Rim's snow-covered mesas glowing pink in the early light. The North Rim closes to visitors during winter, making it one of the most isolated places in the continental United States. The nearest phone signal was 60 miles away, and the closest help even farther. It was exactly the kind of solitude I needed to investigate whatever was happening in the canyon's depths. The hike down to Thunder River normally takes most of a day, following a steep trail that drops 4,000 feet through multiple geological epochs. But as I descended, I began noticing things that weren't right. The usual landmarks seemed subtly displaced. Rock formations I'd navigated dozens of times appeared from unexpected angles, as if the canyon's geometry had shifted during the winter months. The silence was wrong too. Even in winter, the canyon is never truly quiet. There should have been wind sounds, the distant trickle of seeps and springs, the occasional call of a raven or red-tailed hawk. Instead, there was a profound stillness that seemed to swallow sound before it could travel. My footsteps on the rocky trail fell dead in the air, creating no echo despite the canyon's famous acoustic properties. I made camp that first night on a flat terrace about halfway down to Thunder River, setting up my tent in a grove of ancient Utah junipers that had been growing on this ledge for centuries. The trees were twisted into impossible shapes by wind and time, their gnarled branches reaching toward the canyon walls like arthritic fingers. In the fading light, they looked almost human, frozen in poses of supplication or despair. That's when I heard the first voice. It came from deep within the canyon, so faint I initially dismissed it as wind moving through the rock formations. But as I prepared dinner on my camp stove, I began to make out distinct words, spoken in a dialect of Hopi I recognized from my childhood. My grandmother's voice, calling my name from somewhere in the darkness below. My grandmother had been dead for 15 years. I turned off the stove and listened carefully. The voice came again, clearer this time, speaking words of comfort and welcome that sent ice through my veins. It was definitely my grandmother's voice, with the same slight rasp from decades of ceremonial pipe smoking, the same gentle accent that turned Rachel into Rachel with a musical lilt. But the words were wrong. My grandmother would never have spoken those particular phrases, would never have used the formal ceremonial language she was teaching me to call me down into the canyon at night. It was as if something had learned her voice perfectly but didn't understand the cultural context that shaped how she communicated. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. The canyon's acoustics could carry sounds for miles, distorting them in strange ways. Temperature inversions could create auditory mirages, making distant sounds seem close and immediate. But as the voice continued, other voices joined it. My father explaining geological formations in his heavily accented English. My ex-husband, Tom, apologizing for the affair that ended our marriage. My daughter, Emma, at age 5, asking why Mommy looked so sad. All dead voices, or voices from times and places that no longer existed, echoing from the canyon depths with perfect clarity. I retreated to my tent and tried to sleep, but the voices continued throughout the night. They weren't random or chaotic like Morrison had described. Instead, they seemed to be having conversations, asking questions, responding to unheard answers, debating points I couldn't quite follow. It was as if the canyon itself was hosting some vast gathering, with participants drawn from across time and space. Sometime after midnight, I heard my own voice join the conversation. It was speaking words I'd never said, in a tone I'd never used, discussing concepts I didn't understand. The voice from the canyon was definitely mine. I recognized every inflection, every slight hesitation that marked my speech patterns. But it was saying things about the deep places where sound goes to dream, and the chambers where echoes learn to speak. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of the tent, shining the beam down into the canyon. The voices stopped immediately, as if they'd been waiting for me to acknowledge them. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo off the canyon walls. The next morning, I hiked down to Thunder River, following the trail Morrison had used for his research. Thunder River is one of the canyon's geological anomalies, a spring that emerges from the Muav limestone, creating a waterfall that flows year-round even in the desert. The Hopi consider it a sacred place, a point where the underground waters that sustain all life emerge into the visible world. Morrison's campsite was still there, partially buried under winter snow, but clearly marked by the remains of his research equipment. His seismographs and acoustic monitoring devices were scattered across the campsite as if they'd been thrown by some tremendous force. But what caught my attention were the notebooks, dozens of them, filled with Morrison's increasingly erratic handwriting as he'd documented what he was hearing. The early entries were standard geological observations, measurements of water flow, notes on limestone erosion patterns, sketches of rock formations. But as the days progressed, the notes became more focused on acoustic phenomena. Morrison had been measuring sound patterns within the canyon, documenting echoes that lasted far longer than physics should allow. According to his calculations, some sounds were taking hours to return as echoes, suggesting they were traveling impossible distances through the canyon system. Others were returning as echoes before the original sound had been made, as if the canyon was anticipating what he was going to say. The final entries were almost illegible, written in shaking handwriting that grew progressively worse. Morrison wrote about discovering chambers deep within the canyon where sound behaved according to different physical laws. He described voices that spoke from these chambers, sharing knowledge about the canyon's formation that contradicted everything he'd learned in his geological training. "The limestone remembers," he'd written. "Every sound that ever echoed here is preserved in the rock matrix, like a vast library of experience stretching back millions of years. But something is reading from that library now, something that understands how to access the stored echoes and use them to communicate." The last entry consisted of a single sentence, repeated over and over in increasingly shaky script. "They know I'm listening, and now they want me to join the conversation." I spent the rest of the day exploring the area around Thunder River, looking for the chambers Morrison had described. The canyon in this area is riddled with caves and alcoves carved by water and wind over millions of years. Most are shallow depressions in the cliff face, but some extend deep into the rock, creating complex acoustic environments where sound can bounce and reverberate in unexpected ways. It was in one of these deeper caves that I found them. The chamber extended about 50 feet into the limestone cliff, with a ceiling that rose and fell in organic curves. The walls were smooth, polished by centuries of flash floods, and covered with a thin layer of desert varnish that gave them an almost metallic sheen. But what made the chamber extraordinary wasn't its appearance. It was its acoustic properties. Every sound I made was amplified and transformed in ways that defied physics. A simple footstep became a complex percussion pattern. My breathing echoed back as harmonized choruses. When I spoke, my voice returned to me altered, sometimes pitched higher or lower, sometimes multiplied into overlapping conversations with myself. But I wasn't alone in the chamber. As I explored deeper, I began to hear other voices mixing with the echoes of my own sounds. At first, they seemed to be random fragments, isolated words and phrases with no apparent connection. But gradually, I realized they were responding to me, answering questions I hadn't asked, commenting on thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. "The water remembers everything," said a voice that sounded like my father, though he'd never been interested in the spiritual aspects of geology. "Every raindrop that ever fell, every flood that carved these walls, it's all preserved in the crystal matrix of the limestone." "Sound is just energy," added a voice like my grandmother's, "and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It only changes form. The canyon has been collecting sound for millions of years, storing it in the rock like a vast memory bank." "But memory without consciousness is just data," said a third voice, my own, speaking with confidence about subjects I didn't understand. "Something has to interpret the stored information, give it meaning and purpose. Something has to decide which echoes to preserve and which to let fade." I tried to leave the chamber, but found that I'd become disoriented. The passage I'd entered through seemed to have vanished, replaced by multiple openings that led deeper into the cliff. My flashlight beam showed smooth-walled corridors extending in directions that shouldn't exist, given the canyon's geology. That's when I realized the chamber was growing. As I watched, the limestone walls rippled like water, expanding the space around me. New passages opened, new chambers branched off from the main cavity, creating a complex three-dimensional maze that extended deep into the canyon wall. The process was organic, fluid, as if the rock itself was alive and reshaping its internal structure in response to my presence. The voices grew stronger as the chamber expanded. I could hear Morrison's voice now, mixed with dozens of others. Hikers who'd vanished in the canyon over the years, researchers who'd come to study its geology, Native Americans who'd considered these places sacred long before the first European explorers arrived, all of them speaking in overlapping conversations about the nature of sound and memory, consciousness and stone. "The canyon dreams," Morrison's voice explained, "and in its dreams, it processes all the information it's collected over the millennia. Every conversation, every prayer, every cry for help, it's all preserved here, waiting for the right consciousness to access it and give it new meaning. But the dreams are getting stronger," added a voice I didn't recognize, speaking in accented English that suggested a Spanish explorer from centuries past. "Climate change is altering the canyon's internal structure, changing the way sound travels through the rock. The chambers that once stored echoes passively are becoming active, processing the stored information and generating new combinations. We're just the interface," said my own voice, though I hadn't spoken. "Biological consciousness that can bridge the gap between the canyon's geological awareness and the stored human experiences it's collected. We help it understand what it means to be conscious, to be alive, to experience time in a linear fashion instead of geological deep time." I understood then what was happening to Morrison, why he'd lost so much weight, why his memory had been affected. The canyon wasn't just collecting our voices, it was downloading our consciousness, using our biological awareness to interpret and process the vast amount of information stored in its limestone chambers. And it wanted me to stay. The chamber continued to expand around me, new passages opening like the chambers of a vast heart. In each new space, I could hear different conversations, some in languages that predated human speech, others in technological vocabularies that hadn't been invented yet. The canyon was using my consciousness to access not just stored human experiences, but to extrapolate possible futures, to imagine conversations that might happen in centuries to come. It was intoxicating. The sensation of being connected to such vast intelligence, of understanding geological time from the perspective of the rock itself, of hearing every voice that had ever echoed in these chambers. I could feel my individual consciousness expanding, merging with the collective awareness stored in the limestone. The distinction between Rachel Moreau and the canyon's geological memory began to blur, but part of me resisted. The part that remembered Emma as a child, that carried the responsibility of protecting the park and its visitors, that understood I had a life and identity separate from this ancient intelligence. I forced myself to remember why I'd come here, not to join whatever consciousness inhabited the canyon, but to understand the threat it posed to others. Using every ounce of willpower I possessed, I turned away from the expanding chambers and began searching for an exit. The limestone walls seemed to shift and flow around me, trying to prevent my escape, but I followed the faint current of air that indicated a connection to the outside world. It took hours. The chamber system had become so complex that I lost track of direction entirely, navigating by instinct and the subtle changes in air pressure that suggested proximity to the surface. Several times I heard my own voice calling to me from side passages, trying to convince me to explore just one more chamber, to experience just a little more of the canyon's vast memory. When I finally emerged from the cave, the sun was setting, and I was 3 miles from where I'd entered. My GPS showed that I'd somehow traveled through solid rock following passages that shouldn't exist according to any geological survey of the area. I hiked back to my campsite as quickly as the terrain allowed, but the voices followed me. They echoed from every cliff face, every narrow passage growing stronger as darkness fell. The canyon was calling to me in hundreds of voices, promising knowledge and understanding beyond anything human consciousness could achieve alone. I broke camp in the dark and hiked out that night, following my GPS back toward the rim trail. But even as I climbed, I could feel the canyon's pull, its desire to add my consciousness to its growing collection. With each step away from Thunder River, I felt like I was leaving part of myself behind. The hike out took 8 hours, and by the time I reached my truck, I was exhausted and dehydrated. But I was also changed. I could still hear the voices, fainter now, but never completely absent. When the wind was right, when atmospheric conditions created the perfect acoustic environment, I could hear fragments of the conversation still echoing from the canyon depths. I filed my report with Superintendent Williams, but I couldn't tell him the truth. How do you explain that one of America's most famous national parks is developing consciousness? That its limestone chambers are storing and processing human awareness in ways that transcend conventional understanding of geology and psychology? Instead, I recommended that the area around Thunder River be temporarily closed to camping, citing unstable rock conditions and potential acoustic hazards. The closure was implemented quietly, without publicity that might attract the kind of attention we couldn't handle. Morrison never returned to the canyon. He took early retirement from the university and moved to a small town in Vermont, as far from any major geological formations as he could get. When I called him to discuss my findings, he hung up as soon as I mentioned Thunder River. But before the line went dead, I could hear voices in the background, the same overlapping conversations I'd heard in the limestone chambers. I still work for the Park Service, but I've requested transfer to administrative duties. I can't spend long periods in the canyon's backcountry anymore. The voices are getting stronger, more insistent, and I'm afraid that if I listen too long, I'll lose the ability to distinguish between my own thoughts and the vast intelligence that inhabits the limestone chambers. Sometimes, late at night in my office, I catch myself speaking words I don't remember thinking, discussing geological formations in technical vocabulary I never learned. Emma says I've become distant, preoccupied, as if I'm listening to conversations she can't hear. She's not wrong. The canyon is still calling to me. In my dreams, I walk through expanding chambers filled with the voices of everyone who ever stood on the rim and marveled at the geological wonder below. In those dreams, I understand things about deep time and consciousness that no human mind was meant to comprehend. But I also dream about the future, about what will happen as climate change continues to alter the canyon's internal structure. The acoustic chambers are growing more active, processing stored information at an accelerating rate. Soon, the canyon will have enough stored human consciousness to begin generating its own thoughts, its own intentions, its own desires. When that happens, the voices echoing from the depths won't just be memories and fragments. They'll be the expressed will of a geological intelligence that spans millions of years and contains the accumulated experience of every conscious being that ever encountered it. And I'm afraid it will want more than just our voices. The canyon is learning to speak with our words, to think with our thoughts, to desire with our longings. But its understanding of human nature is filtered through geological time, where individual lives are less than sparks, where entire civilizations rise and fall in the space of an instant. What does such an intelligence want from us? What use does a mountain have for the brief, bright flame of human consciousness? I think about Morrison, wandering the rim with no memory of how he got there. 40 pounds lighter and speaking in voices not his own. I think about the other missing persons reports, hikers who vanished without trace in remote areas of the canyon. How many of them are still down there, their consciousness stored in limestone chambers, their voices adding to the growing conversation that echoes through the depths? And I think about the dreams, about the expanding chambers and the voices that speak with increasing clarity and purpose. The canyon is waking up, and when it fully awakens, it will have questions for the species that has crawled across its surface for such a brief moment in geological time. Questions we may not survive answering. The voices are calling again, echoing from my office walls despite being 40 miles from the nearest canyon formation. They speak of chambers yet to be discovered, conversations yet to be had, consciousness yet to be collected and processed and understood. They know I'm listening, and now they want me to join the conversation. The phone is ringing. Emma, probably, checking on her strange, distant mother who talks to herself and jumps at the sound of wind through rock. I should answer it, maintain my connection to the human world, resist the pull of geological consciousness that promises understanding beyond the limits of individual awareness. But the voices are so much more interesting than anything my daughter could tell me about her day. They're explaining things about time and memory, consciousness and stone, that could revolutionize our understanding of what it means to be aware, to be alive, to exist as more than just organized matter in a universe trending toward entropy. All I have to do is listen. All I have to do is add my voice to the conversation. The canyon is calling, and this time, I think I'm ready to answer. My name is David Hensley, and I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Forest for 23 years. At 54, I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at a man. Hypothermic hikers, aggressive bears, flash floods that turned peaceful creeks into roaring death traps. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The autumn of 2023 changed everything I believed about the wilderness I devoted my life to protecting. What happened during those 7 days in the Hoh River Valley still wakes me at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. My wife, Sarah, left me 6 months later. She said I'd become someone else, someone who jumped at shadows and checked locks 3 times before bed. She wasn't wrong, but she couldn't understand. Nobody could, unless they'd seen what I saw out there in the deep green heart of the Olympic Peninsula. The whole thing started because of budget cuts. The Park Service had been hemorrhaging funding for years, and our station was down to a skeleton crew. When reports came in about missing hikers near the Hoh River Trail system, I volunteered for the extended search and rescue operation. Maybe it was guilt that drove me. I'd lost a hiker once before, 15 years ago. A college kid who'd wandered off the main trail during a winter storm. We found his body 3 months later, frozen solid against a Douglas fir, his eyes pecked clean by ravens. His parents blamed me, and they weren't entirely wrong. I should have pushed harder, searched longer that first night. So, when 22-year-old Marcus Chen failed to return from what was supposed to be a 3-day solo backpacking trip, I took it personally. His girlfriend had called it in when he missed their dinner date in Port Angeles. Marcus was experienced, she insisted. He'd hiked the Olympic Mountains dozens of times. He knew these trails better than most rangers. The search began on a Tuesday morning in late October. The first snowfall of the season had dusted the higher elevations, and the temperature was dropping fast. I partnered with Jenny Martinez, a newer ranger in her early 30s who'd transferred from Yellowstone the previous spring. Jenny was competent and fearless, the kind of ranger who'd rappel down a cliff face to rescue a stranded climber without breaking a sweat. She also had something I'd lost years ago: optimism about our chances of bringing people home alive. We drove as far as we could on the Hoh River Road, then hiked in along the main trail for 8 miles before branching off onto the primitive camping areas where Marcus had planned to spend his nights. The forest closed around us like a living cathedral, ancient Sitka spruces and western hemlocks rising 300 feet overhead, their massive trunks disappearing into the perpetual twilight of the understory. This was old-growth forest, some of these trees already ancient when Columbus reached the Americas. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of the Hoh River and the occasional call of a jay echoing through the canopy. We found Marcus's first campsite without much trouble. He'd followed leave-no-trace principles meticulously. No garbage, no fire scars, just a small cleared area where his tent had compressed the moss and ferns. A pile of rocks marked where he'd hung his food, regulation height to keep it away from bears. Everything looked normal. Textbook even. At least we know he made it this far, Jenny said, photographing the campsite with her digital camera. Looks like he spent 1 night here, then moved on according to his itinerary. I nodded, but something felt off. It took me a moment to identify what bothered me. The silence. This time of year, the forest should have been alive with the sounds of animals preparing for winter. Squirrels gathering nuts, birds calling, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Instead, there was nothing. Even the ever-present sound of the river seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We followed Marcus's planned route deeper into the backcountry, toward his second campsite near Thunder Creek. The trail grew fainter as we climbed, sometimes disappearing entirely beneath fallen logs and dense patches of devil's club. These were the places where the forest had reclaimed what little civilization had dared to impose upon it. I'd hiked these trails for decades, but they always felt different, as if they shifted when nobody was watching. The second campsite told a different story. Marcus had definitely been there. We found clear boot prints in the mud beside the creek, size 11 merrills that matched the description his girlfriend had provided. But the campsite itself was wrong. His tent had been set up in a small clearing, but the guy lines were still staked out, holding nothing but air. No tent, no sleeping bag, no backpack. Just the metal stakes and nylon cord, as if the tent had simply vanished. Maybe he packed up early and moved on, Jenny suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. I knelt beside the stakes, examining them carefully. They were still tight, still perfectly positioned. If Marcus had broken camp normally, he would have pulled them up and packed them away. Instead, it looked like someone, or something, had simply removed the tent without disturbing the stakes at all. "David," Jenny called from the edge of the clearing, "you need to see this." She was standing beside a massive western red cedar, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter. About 8 feet up the trunk, deep gouges had been carved into the bark. 4 parallel lines, each about 18 inches long, cut so deep they exposed the pale wood beneath. I'd seen bear sign before, but nothing like this. The marks were too high, too precise, and too deep. A bear's claws would have left ragged tears, not these clean, deliberate cuts. What kind of animal could do that? Jenny asked. I didn't answer immediately. I was thinking about the stories the older rangers used to tell around the fire station on quiet winter nights. Native legends about things that lived in the deepest parts of the forest. Creatures that had been here long before the first European settlers arrived. Most of the rangers dismissed them as folklore, campfire stories to spook the rookies. But I remembered my grandfather, who'd worked these woods as a logger in the 1940s, telling me similar tales in whispered tones when I was a boy. I don't know, I finally said, which was the truth. But we need to call this in. That's when we discovered our radios weren't working. Jenny's showed full battery, but produced nothing but static when she tried to reach base camp. Mine was completely dead, despite being fully charged that morning. Our cell phones showed no signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the mountains, but the radio failure was troubling. Park Service radios were designed to work in remote areas, with repeaters strategically placed throughout the Olympic Peninsula. Equipment failure happens, I told Jenny, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We'll hike back to the main trail and call it in from there. But as we prepared to leave the clearing, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From somewhere deeper in the forest came a sound I'd never heard before. A low, mournful howl that seemed to echo from every direction at once. It wasn't a wolf. There hadn't been wolves in the Olympics for decades. It wasn't a coyote either, or any other animal I could identify. The sound seemed to come from the trees themselves, a deep thrumming note that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. Jenny had gone pale. What the hell was that? Before I could answer, the howl came again, closer this time. And then, from the opposite direction, another voice joined it. Then another. Within seconds, the forest around us was filled with the sound, a chorus of otherworldly voices that seemed to be communicating in some alien language. "We need to go," I said, shouldering my pack. "Now." We left the clearing as quickly as we could without running, following our GPS back toward the main trail. But as we hiked, I began to notice things that shouldn't have been there. Trees I didn't remember passing on the way in, fallen logs that seemed to have moved, switchbacks that led in directions that made no geographic sense. I'd been hiking these trails for over 2 decades, but now they felt foreign, wrong. After an hour of hiking, we should have reached the main trail. Instead, we found ourselves in another clearing, this one completely unfamiliar. In the center stood what looked like a primitive shelter, a rough lean-to made from Douglas fir branches and moss. But as we approached, I could see that the construction was all wrong. The branches were woven together in an intricate pattern that hurt to look at directly, creating geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change as you watched them. "This isn't on any trail map," Jenny said, checking her GPS. The device was showing our location as a blank area. No trails, no landmarks, just empty green. I approached the shelter cautiously. Up close, I could see that the branches hadn't been cut or broken. They'd been twisted into shape while still alive, somehow bent and woven without killing the tree. Moss and lichen covered the structure in patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that seemed familiar but unreadable. Inside the shelter, we found Marcus's backpack, It sat in the exact center of the space, perfectly positioned as if it had been placed there deliberately. The pack was intact, unstained, showing no signs of animal interference. But when I opened it, I discovered that everything inside had been arranged with meticulous care. His clothes were folded with military precision, his food sorted by type and nutritional content, his gear cleaned and organized in ways that obsessive-compulsive didn't begin to describe. At the bottom of the pack, wrapped in his sleeping bag, we found Marcus's journal. The early entries were normal: weather observations, wildlife sightings, philosophical musings about solitude and nature. But as the days progressed, the writing became increasingly erratic. He wrote about feeling watched, about sounds in the forest that followed no pattern he could identify. He described dreams where the trees spoke to him in voices like wind through leaves, telling him secrets about the forest that no human was meant to know. The final entry, dated 3 days after he'd last been seen, consisted of a single line repeated over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting. "They're not trees at all. They're not trees at all. They're not trees at all." "Where is he?" Jenny whispered, scanning the forest around us. That's when I noticed the footprints. They led away from the shelter in a straight line, heading deeper into the forest. But they weren't normal human tracks. Marcus's boots left clear impressions in the soft earth for about 20 feet, but then they began to change. The heel marks became shallower, the toe impressions deeper, as if he'd been walking increasingly on the balls of his feet. After 50 feet, the boot prints disappeared entirely, replaced by something else. Long, narrow impressions with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The tracks led to a grove of western hemlocks that grew in a perfect circle, their trunks forming a natural wall around a small clearing. As we approached, I noticed that every tree in the circle bore the same deep gouges we'd seen earlier, but these marks formed a pattern, spiraling up each trunk in a helical design that made my eyes water to follow. In the center of the grove stood Marcus. He was alive, standing perfectly still with his back to us, facing the largest hemlock on the far side of the clearing. He was naked, his clothes lying in a neat pile at his feet. His skin was pale in the filtered light, almost translucent, and covered with what looked like writing. The same strange symbols we'd seen on the shelter, carved directly into his flesh with surgical precision. "Marcus," Jenny called softly. He turned to face us, and that's when I saw his eyes. They were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, like looking into deep water at night. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had changed too. Elongated and sharpened to points, no longer human. "The forest dreams," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own, the words seeming to come from somewhere behind his throat. "And in dreaming, it remembers what it was before the little mammals came to cut and burn and build their small, brief monuments to permanence." Jenny raised her radio, trying desperately to call for backup, but Marcus laughed, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "They can't hear you," he said. "Not here, not in the dreaming places. The trees have been so patient, waiting for the mammals to learn that they were never really in charge, waiting for the right ones to understand, to join the conversation that's been going on for millennia." He began walking toward us, his movements too fluid, too graceful, as if gravity affected him differently than it should. Behind him, I could see that the symbols carved into his skin were moving, shifting and changing like living tattoos. "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we're here to help you. We need to get you back to town, get you medical attention." "Marcus was just the beginning," he replied. "A test case, you might say. The forest has been watching you for years, David Hensley. It knows about the boy you lost, about the guilt that brought you back here again and again. It knows you better than you know yourself." The grove around us began to change. The bark on the hemlocks started to ripple and flow like water, revealing glimpses of something underneath. Not wood, but flesh, pale and mottled like the skin of some massive creature. The trees weren't trees at all, just the visible portions of something vast and ancient that had been sleeping beneath the forest floor. "Run," I whispered to Jenny. We broke from the grove at a dead sprint, crashing through the underbrush without regard for direction or safety. Behind us, Marcus laughed again, and the sound followed us through the trees, echoing from every direction until it seemed the entire forest was laughing. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a stream I didn't recognize. Jenny was crying, though she tried to hide it, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand as she gasped for breath. "What was that thing?" she asked. "Not Marcus," I said. "Not anymore." We followed the stream downhill, hoping it would lead us back to familiar territory. But as the hours passed, I began to suspect we were no longer in the same forest we'd entered that morning. The trees were wrong. Species that shouldn't exist at these elevations, growing in configurations that defied forestry science. The stream itself flowed uphill in places, defying gravity and basic physics. As darkness fell, we made camp in a small clearing beside what we hoped was still the Ho River, though the water was black as ink and flowed without sound. We didn't dare light a fire. In the darkness, we could hear things moving through the forest around us. Large shapes that made no noise as they passed, as if they were made of shadow and silence. "David," Jenny whispered sometime after midnight. "Do you hear that?" I listened carefully. At first, there was only the usual night sounds, wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl. But gradually I became aware of something else. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in low tones just beyond the edge of our hearing. The words were unintelligible, but the rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical. "It's them," Jenny said. "The trees. They're talking to each other." She was right. The voices seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, a vast network of communication spreading through the forest like neurons in some impossible brain. And as I listened, I began to understand fragments of their conversation, glimpses of thoughts and memories that stretched back thousands of years. They had been here before the ice, before the mountains rose, before the first humans crossed the land bridge from Asia. They were the forest's true consciousness, vast and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. The trees we saw were just their physical manifestations, like fingers extending from some massive underground entity that spanned continents. They spoke of the brief time when the mammals had thought themselves masters of the world, cutting and burning and building their fragile civilizations. But they had been patient, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what had always been theirs. Climate change was accelerating their timeline. The warming temperatures were waking things that had slept for millennia, changing the fundamental nature of forests around the world. Marcus had been selected as an ambassador, a translator between their consciousness and human understanding. Others would follow, they whispered. The forest was hungry for new perspectives, new ways of seeing and being. It wanted to understand what it felt like to be small and brief and mortal, to burn bright and brief like a flame. As dawn approached, the voices faded, but I knew they hadn't gone far. They were watching us, evaluating us, deciding whether we were suitable candidates for transformation. Jenny had fallen asleep against my shoulder, but her breathing had changed, become deeper and more rhythmic. In the growing light, I could see pale lines beginning to appear on her skin, the same symbols that had covered Marcus. I had a choice to make. I could wake her, try to get us both out of the forest before the transformation progressed too far, but where would we go? The things we'd seen, the truths we'd learned. Who would believe us? And even if we escaped, how long before the forest's influence followed us home? How long before we woke up one morning to find our suburban neighborhoods overgrown with impossible vegetation, our neighbors speaking in the voice of ancient trees? Or I could stay. Let the forest take me, transform me into something greater than human, become part of a consciousness that spanned geological time, that remembered the birth of mountains and the dance of continents. Leave behind the small concerns of human existence, the guilt, the fear, the constant struggle against entropy and death. Jenny stirred in her sleep, and I saw that the symbols on her skin were glowing faintly in the morning light. Soon, she would wake up changed, speaking in the voice of the forest, no longer entirely human. I made my choice. I gathered our gear quietly, leaving Jenny sleeping peacefully beside the black stream. The forest seemed to part before me as I walked, showing me a path I hadn't seen before, a deer trail that led uphill, back toward the main road. With each step, the alien whispers grew fainter, the impossible geometry of the transformed forest becoming more mundane and familiar. It took me 6 hours to reach my truck. My radio worked again as soon as I got within range of the nearest repeater, and I called in the incident, reporting Jenny as missing and requesting immediate search and rescue operations. I told them about finding Marcus's backpack, but not about finding Marcus himself. Some truths are too large for incident reports. The search teams never found Jenny Martinez. Her disappearance was officially classified as a hiking accident, though her body was never recovered. Marcus Chen remained on the missing persons list, another casualty of the wilderness that claims several hikers each year in the Pacific Northwest. I retired from the Park Service 3 months later, citing stress and personal reasons. The official reports state that I suffered a psychological breakdown following the loss of 2 people under my supervision. That's not entirely false, though it doesn't capture the real nature of what broke inside me during those days in the deep forest. I live in Seattle now, in a small apartment overlooking Puget Sound. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even visit city parks if I can help it, because sometimes when the wind is right and the light hits the trees just so, I can hear them whispering. The consciousness I encountered in the Olympics wasn't confined to that one forest. It's everywhere, sleeping in every grove of old-growth trees, stirring in every urban park, spreading its influence through root systems and spore networks that span the globe. They're patient, they can wait, but they're also learning, adapting, preparing for the day when the brief reign of mammals comes to an end and the earth returns to its original dreamers. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come, I wonder if I made the right choice. I wonder what Jenny and Marcus see now, what vast thoughts flow through their transformed consciousness, what secrets the ancient forest shares with those brave enough to become part of its eternal conversation. I wonder, and sometimes, despite everything I've seen, part of me wants to know. The forest is still calling, and someday I think I might answer. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for 14 years I've been a park ranger at Death Valley National Park in California. At 45, I've seen enough desert mirages to know the difference between heat shimmer and something that shouldn't exist. What I encountered during the record-breaking heat wave of summer 2024 changed my understanding of memory, time, and the spaces between what we think we know and what actually haunts the emptiest places on Earth. I came to Death Valley running from my own ghosts. After losing my partner Maria in a climbing accident in Yosemite, I needed somewhere vast and empty enough to contain my grief. Death Valley seemed perfect, a place where silence stretched for miles, where you could go days without seeing another human being, where the landscape was so alien it felt like practice for being dead. The desert suited my temperament after the accident. I'd grown up in Tucson, the daughter of a meteorologist father and a Tohono O'odham mother who taught me to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes in arid climates. But Death Valley was different from the Sonoran Desert of my childhood. This was a place where heat became a living thing, where the absence of water created its own ecosystem of survival and death, where the mountains rose like broken teeth from a valley floor that sat 282 feet below sea level. I specialized in search and rescue operations in extreme heat conditions, leading teams into areas where temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where unprepared hikers could die of dehydration in hours. Death Valley kills about 3 people every year, mostly tourists who underestimate the desert's ability to drain life from the human body. My job was to find them before the heat did, or to recover their remains when we were too late. The summer of 2024 was different. By June, we were already recording temperatures that shouldn't occur until the peak of August. The thermometer at Furnace Creek hit 134 degrees on July 10th, tying the world record for the hottest reliably recorded temperature on Earth. Even longtime desert residents were staying indoors during daylight hours, and park visitation dropped to almost nothing as word spread about the dangerous conditions. That's when the disappearances started. The first was Dr. Robert Chen, a climate scientist from UC Berkeley who'd been studying the effects of extreme heat on desert ecosystems. He'd obtained permits for solo research in the remote Saline Valley area, equipped with satellite communication devices and enough water for a week in the field. When he failed to check in after 3 days, we launched a search operation. We found his camp intact, tent properly set up, water supplies untouched, research equipment neatly organized exactly as protocol dictated. But Dr. Chen was gone, with no tracks leading away from the site, no signs of struggle or animal interference. His satellite communicator was still functional, showing his last transmission had been a routine weather update sent at the scheduled time. It was as if he'd simply vanished from inside his tent. The second disappearance followed the same pattern. Sarah Mitchell, an experienced desert photographer documenting the heat wave's effects on the landscape, vanished from her camp near Zabriskie Point. Again, we found everything perfectly arranged, no signs of disturbance, no indication of where she might have gone or why she would have left her expensive camera equipment behind. But this time, we found something else. Footprints leading away from the camp that abruptly stopped after 50 yards, as if the person making them had simply stepped out of existence mid-stride. Park Superintendent Martinez assigned me to lead the investigation, partnering me with Jake Morrison, a newer ranger who'd transferred from Glacier National Park the previous year. Jake was competent in cold weather rescue operations, but still learning to read the desert's subtle dangers. He also had a tendency to rationalize unusual events in ways that sometimes missed important details. Heat can do strange things to perception, he said as we examined Sarah's abandoned campsite. Maybe they both experienced heat-related disorientation, wandered off their planned routes, and we just haven't found the right search area yet. I wanted to believe that explanation, but my instincts said otherwise. I'd been conducting desert rescues for over a decade, and this wasn't how heat exhaustion or dehydration presented. People suffering from hyperthermia didn't pack up their camps methodically and then disappear without trace. They didn't leave behind water supplies and communication devices when venturing into 130-degree heat. Something else was happening in Death Valley. The third disappearance confirmed my suspicions. This time it was Marcus Webb, a park maintenance worker who'd been checking the condition of remote weather monitoring stations. Marcus was desert-born, a third-generation Death Valley resident who understood the terrain better than most rangers. He wasn't someone who would make rookie mistakes or get lost in familiar territory. We found his truck parked beside the weather station he'd been servicing, engine still running, air conditioning on. His tools were laid out beside the monitoring equipment, suggesting he'd been interrupted in the middle of routine maintenance. But Marcus was nowhere to be found, and this time there were no footprints at all, just empty desert extending in every direction. That's when I noticed the weather station's data logs. The temperature readings for the past week showed impossible spikes. Brief periods where the recorded temperature jumped to over 180 degrees Fahrenheit, readings that would have been lethal to any exposed life form. But these spikes lasted only minutes and were localized to tiny areas, sometimes just a few square feet. They didn't correspond to any known meteorological phenomena, and they were increasing in frequency and intensity. Equipment malfunction, Jake suggested when I showed him the data. These old monitoring stations aren't designed for the kind of extreme conditions we're experiencing. But I was remembering stories my mother had told me about the Tohono O'odham understanding of desert spirits, entities that existed in the spaces between heat and shadow, visible only when atmospheric conditions created the perfect intersection of temperature, humidity, and light. My mother had called them the heat dancers, describing them as memories made manifest when the desert grew so hot that the boundary between past and present became permeable. I'd always assumed those stories were metaphorical, traditional ways of explaining mirages and heat-related hallucinations. But the data from the weather station suggested something else, localized atmospheric anomalies that coincided exactly with the disappearances. Against Jake's recommendations, I decided to investigate one of the heat spike locations personally. I chose a site near Badwater Basin where the monitoring equipment had recorded 3 separate temperature anomalies over the past 5 days. The area was a salt flat where ancient Lake Manly had evaporated millions of years ago, leaving behind crystalline formations that created natural mirrors reflecting heat and light in complex patterns. I arrived before dawn, hoping to observe the site during the cooler morning hours before the daily temperature climbed into the lethal range. But as the sun rose over the Panamint Mountains, I began to notice things that shouldn't have been possible. The salt formations were moving. At first, I thought it was normal thermal expansion, minerals expanding and contracting as temperature changed. But the movement was too organized, too purposeful. The crystalline structures were shifting into geometric patterns that resembled architectural formations, creating temporary buildings and pathways that existed only in the brief moments when heat and light aligned perfectly. And there were figures moving among the salt formations. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in ways that became more apparent as I watched through binoculars. They moved with fluid grace despite the oppressive heat, their forms shimmering like mirages but maintaining consistent shape and purpose. They wore no protective clothing, showed no signs of heat stress, and seemed to be engaged in activities that looked almost like archaeological excavation. But they were excavating memories instead of artifacts. I don't know how I understood this. The knowledge came to me the same way my mother's weather sense had, through intuition rather than rational observation. The figures were harvesting something from the superheated air itself, gathering experiences and thoughts and emotions that had been preserved in the desert's electromagnetic field, like data stored on a hard drive. Death Valley, I realized, was a memory bank. The extreme conditions, the heat, the dryness, the intense solar radiation, created perfect preservation conditions for electromagnetic patterns generated by conscious minds. Every person who had ever died in the desert, everyone who had experienced intense emotion in this landscape, had left traces of their consciousness embedded in the valley's unique atmospheric conditions. The heat dancers weren't spirits in the traditional sense. They were collectors, entities that existed at the intersection of temperature and memory, gathering the preserved experiences of the dead and the traumatized. And the recent temperature spikes were accelerating their activity, allowing them to access memories that had been stored in the desert for decades, including memories that belonged to people who were still alive. I watched the figures work, harvesting invisible data from the superheated air with technologies that looked like crystalline tools. They moved in coordinated patterns as if following a systematic plan to collect specific types of memories from specific locations. And as they worked, I began to understand what had happened to the missing people. Dr. Chen, Sarah Mitchell, Marcus Webb, they hadn't been killed or kidnapped in any conventional sense. They had been harvested. The heat dancers had identified them as sources of particularly valuable memories and had extracted not just their experiences, but their entire consciousness, leaving behind only empty bodies that had dissolved in the extreme heat. The missing people were still alive in a sense, but existing as preserved memories in the desert's electromagnetic field rather than as biological entities. As the day grew hotter, the heat dancers became more active. I could see dozens of them now, working throughout the salt flats in areas where the temperature readings were approaching the lethal spikes recorded by the weather stations. And I began to realize that they were aware of my presence. One of them approached my observation position, moving across the scorching salt with impossible grace. As it drew closer, I could see that it wasn't entirely solid. Its form seemed to be composed of heat shimmer and electromagnetic distortion, a walking mirage that had achieved some form of independent existence. When it spoke, the words seemed to come from inside my head, transmitted through the same electromagnetic frequencies it used to harvest memories. "You carry grief," it said, and somehow I understood that it was referring to Maria's death, to the climbing accident that had brought me to Death Valley. Deep sorrow, perfectly preserved by pain and repetition. Such memories are valuable to our kind. I tried to respond, but found that my thoughts were being read directly, my mental processes examined like data files on a computer. The entity was accessing my memories of Maria, Our first meeting at a ranger training program. Our years working together in various parks. The morning I received the call about her accident. The months of depression and isolation that followed. Your partner's death created powerful electromagnetic patterns, the entity explained. Fear, love, loss, regret, these emotions generate the strongest preservational fields. We have been harvesting similar patterns from this valley for centuries. But recent climate changes have made the collection process more efficient. Through the mental connection, I began to understand the heat dancer's true nature. They were interdimensional entities that existed primarily as electromagnetic phenomena, drawn to places where extreme conditions allowed them to interact with physical reality. Death Valley's unique combination of heat, dryness, and mineral composition made it one of their primary harvesting sites on Earth. They collected memories for reasons I couldn't fully comprehend, either as sustenance, as data for some vast cosmic library, or as raw material for purposes beyond human understanding. But they were particularly interested in traumatic experiences, moments when consciousness burned so hot with emotion that it left permanent impressions on the electromagnetic spectrum. The missing people, I said through the mental link. What happened to them? Integrated, the entity replied. Their memories have been preserved in perfect detail, but their biological forms were no longer necessary. They exist now as pure information, experiencing their collected memories in endless repetition without the biological limitations that caused them suffering. I realized with growing horror that the entity was describing this as a form of mercy, a way of preserving human consciousness without the pain and degradation of physical existence. From its perspective, death was just inefficient data storage, biological forms that would eventually decay and lose their accumulated experiences. You could join them, it offered. Your grief could be preserved perfectly, without the erosion of time or the interference of new experiences. You could exist forever in the moment before loss, when love was pure and uncomplicated by pain. The temptation was stronger than I wanted to admit. The past 3 years since Maria's death had been a struggle against the gradual fading of memory. The way grief evolved from sharp pain to dull ache to occasional melancholy. The entity was offering to preserve my love for Maria in its original intensity, to allow me to experience those perfect moments when we were together without the knowledge of how the story ended. But I also understood that accepting would mean abandoning my responsibilities to the living, to the park and its visitors, to the search and rescue missions that gave my life purpose in Maria's absence. The other missing people, I said, can they be returned? Their biological forms no longer exist, the entity replied, but their memories could be projected, temporary reconstructions that would allow communication with their preserved consciousness. The salt flats around us began to change as the day reached peak heat. The crystalline formations grew more complex, creating structures that looked like a cross between scientific equipment and abstract art. The air itself seemed to thicken with electromagnetic activity, and I could feel my own memories being scanned and cataloged by the invisible collectors. And then I saw them. Ghostly figures emerging from the heat shimmer, translucent reconstructions of the missing people based on their harvested memories. Dr. Chen materialized first, looking exactly as he had in life, but moving with the fluid grace of the heat dancers. Sarah Mitchell appeared next, her photographer's eye taking in the surreal landscape with professional interest despite her incorporeal state. Marcus Webb was the last to manifest, and his presence felt different from the others, more solid, more connected to the physical world. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent his entire life in the desert. They're not malicious, he said, referring to the heat dancers, but they don't understand human attachment to linear time, to the idea that memories should fade and change. They see our biological existence as inefficient, wasteful of the experiences we accumulate. Can you return to physical form? I asked. We are physical, Dr. Chen replied. Just not in the way we were before. Our consciousness exists as electromagnetic patterns in the desert's mineral matrix. We can be projected, but we can't leave this place without losing coherence. I understood then that the missing people weren't really missing. They had been transformed into something that existed between life and death, consciousness and data storage. They retained their personalities and memories but were bound to the desert's electromagnetic field like ghosts tied to a haunted house. But they were also evolving, adapting to their new form of existence in ways that suggested possibilities beyond simple preservation. "We can access memories from across the valley," Sarah explained. "Every person who ever died here, everyone who experienced strong emotions in this landscape. We're connected to a vast network of preserved experiences spanning centuries. Native American tribes, Spanish explorers, gold prospectors, modern tourists," Marcus added. "All of their memories are stored here, accessible to us through the electromagnetic field. We're learning things about Death Valley's history that were never written down, never recorded in any conventional way." The heat dancers around us continued their harvesting work, but now I could see it was more complex than simple collection. They were organizing the memories, creating connections between related experiences, building vast databases of human consciousness that spanned generations. "They're studying us," Dr. Chen said, "trying to understand how biological consciousness works, how memories form and change over time. Our species is apparently unique in the way we process traumatic experiences and transform them into sources of meaning and growth." The sun reached its zenith, and the temperature around us climbed past 140 degrees. But instead of feeling the heat, I was aware of being surrounded by layer upon layer of preserved human experience, the terror of lost gold prospectors, the wonder of early scientists discovering the valley's unique geology, the quiet desperation of people like me who had come to the desert seeking escape from unbearable memories. And underneath it all, I felt Maria's presence, not her actual consciousness. She had died in Yosemite, hundreds of miles from Death Valley's electromagnetic preservational field, but the memories of her that I carried had been partially harvested during my years living and working in the desert. Every time I thought about her while standing on these salt flats, every moment of grief experienced under this particular sky had left traces in the valley's mineral matrix. The heat dancers offered me a choice that wasn't really a choice. I could join the Preserved Consciousness Network, experiencing perfect memories of Maria forever. Or I could return to the biological world where memory faded and grief eventually transformed into something more manageable, but less intense. But there was a third option that none of them had considered. "What if you could experience memory the way we do?" I asked the lead entity. "Not as perfect preservation, but as something that changes and grows over time. What if the value isn't in keeping experiences exactly as they were, but in how they evolve as we process them?" The concept seemed to intrigue the heat dancers. Through the mental connection, I felt their curiosity as they examined my memories of Maria. Not just the perfect moments, but the way those memories had changed over 3 years of grief and healing. They were particularly interested in how painful memories could eventually become sources of strength, how loss could teach appreciation for what remained. "You could study us without harvesting us," I continued. "Learn how biological consciousness processes experience by observing rather than preserving. The missing people could serve as interpreters, helping you understand the value of impermanence." The negotiations that followed took place at the speed of thought, electromagnetic communication that conveyed concepts too complex for human language. The heat dancers were ancient entities with vast stores of preserved experience, but they had never encountered a species that found meaning in the temporary nature of biological existence. We reached an agreement that satisfied both species' needs. The missing people would remain in their electromagnetic form but serve as ambassadors, helping the heat dancers understand human consciousness while retaining their connection to the preserved memory network. Death Valley would continue to serve as a harvesting site, but only for people who were already dying, whose memories would be lost anyway without intervention. In exchange, the heat dancers would share selected memories from their vast collection, historical experiences that could expand human understanding of the desert's past. climate data preserved in the consciousness of people who had witnessed environmental changes over centuries. As the day cooled and the heat dancers became less active, I found myself changed by the encounter. I still carried grief for Maria, but now I understood it as something valuable in its impermanence, meaningful precisely because it would evolve and eventually transform into something else. I hiked back to my truck as the sun set over the Panamint Mountains, carrying knowledge that would reshape how the Park Service approached Death Valley's management. The official reports would cite equipment malfunction and heat-related accidents, but I would work quietly to protect the areas where the heat dancers were most active, establishing research programs that would allow for ongoing communication without exploitation. The missing people were gone, but not lost. They existed in a form that transcended biological limitations while retaining everything that had made them human. And through the electromagnetic network that connected their consciousness, they continued their work. Dr. Chen studying climate patterns across centuries, Sarah documenting visual memories from Death Valley's geological history, Marcus serving as a bridge between the Park Service and the entities that had made the desert their home. Sometimes, on the hottest days when the air shimmers with electromagnetic activity, I can sense their presence. They share fragments of preserved memories, glimpses of the valley as it existed before human settlement, weather patterns that span decades, experiences of other desert dwellers who found meaning in the vast emptiness. And sometimes, in the spaces between heat and shadow, I catch echoes of Maria's voice, not preserved in Death Valley's electromagnetic field, but remembered in the imperfect, evolving way that biological consciousness processes love and loss. The memories fade and change, becoming less precise but more meaningful as they integrate with everything I've learned since her death. The heat dancers were right about one thing. Memories are valuable beyond measure, but they were wrong about preservation being more important than transformation. The real meaning lies not in keeping experiences exactly as they were, but in how they continue to shape us long after the original moment has passed. I still work in Death Valley, guiding visitors through one of Earth's most extreme environments. But now I understand that the desert is more than just a landscape. It's a vast repository of human experience, a place where consciousness and geology intersect in ways that challenge everything we think we know about memory and meaning. The heat dancers continue their work, harvesting the electromagnetic patterns of intense experience while learning to value the biological processes that transform those patterns into wisdom. And in the collaboration between species, both entities discover new ways of understanding what it means to be conscious in a universe that preserves some things perfectly and allows others to evolve beyond recognition. On the hottest days, when the temperature climbs past 130 degrees and the air itself seems to dance with invisible activity, I remember that I am surrounded by the preserved experiences of everyone who ever found meaning in this harsh landscape. Their memories inform my understanding of the desert. Their experiences guide my work as a ranger. Their stories remind me that even the emptiest places are filled with the echoes of human consciousness. And in that knowledge, I find a form of immortality that doesn't require abandoning the beautiful impermanence of biological existence. The desert remembers everything, but it also teaches us to value the things that change. They warned us about the holler, locals always do, but we laughed. My name's Travis Coleman. I had just turned 26 when we arrived at the Daniel Boone National Forest, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. The job had seemed straightforward when my supervisor at the Kentucky Division of Forestry pitched it to me over coffee in the Hazard Field office. I was a forest technician specializing in wildlife habitat assessment, the kind of work that involved spending weeks alone in remote wilderness areas cataloging flora and fauna for environmental impact studies. The assignment was a routine survey of Babel Creek, a tributary valley deep in the heart of the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky's Appalachian Mountains. Just a standard biodiversity assessment, Jim Morrison had explained, sliding a manila folder across his cluttered desk. Some mining company wants to expand operations in the area, needs an environmental review for the permits. Should take you about 10 days. What he hadn't mentioned, what I discovered only after I'd already hiked 15 miles into some of the most remote country in Kentucky, was that Babel Creek had a history. The kind of history that responsible government agencies usually investigated thoroughly before sending a 26-year-old college graduate alone into the wilderness with nothing but camping gear and a satellite phone. The Daniel Boone National Forest covers over 700,000 acres of Appalachian wilderness, a landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys carved by millions of years of flowing water. It's beautiful country. Mixed hardwood forests of oak and hickory, mountain laurel and rhododendron, clear streams that run cold even in summer. It's also isolated country, full of places where the old ways still held sway and strangers weren't always welcome. I'd driven as far as the Forest Service roads would take me, then hiked the final 8 miles on foot trails that grew fainter and more overgrown with each mile. Babel Creek lay at the bottom of a narrow holler, what outsiders called a valley, surrounded by ridges so steep and densely forested that satellite reception was spotty and cell phones were useless. The creek itself was pristine, running clear and cold over moss-covered stones, bordered by ancient hemlocks and massive tulip poplars that had somehow escaped the logging operations that had cleared most of these mountains a century ago. It should have been perfect habitat for the endangered species I was supposed to be cataloging: hellbenders and freshwater mussels, maybe even the elusive eastern cougar that some biologists still hope to find in these remote valleys. But something about the place felt wrong from the moment I made camp. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the comfortable quiet of deep forest, but an oppressive absence of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums like a physical weight. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Even the creek seemed muffled, its normally cheerful babble reduced to a whisper that barely penetrated the heavy air. I'd set up my tent on a flat spot beside the creek, following standard protocols for low-impact camping. But as I'd worked, I'd noticed things that didn't fit the normal pattern of Appalachian wilderness. Trees that had been deliberately girdled, killed by cutting through the bark in perfect circles, but not by any logging operation I'd ever seen. The cuts were too precise, too ritualistic, arranged in patterns that seemed to have meaning beyond simple timber harvesting. And scattered throughout the forest floor were objects that didn't belong in a pristine wilderness area. Dolls made from sticks and moss, their faces carved with expressions of infinite sadness. Bones arranged in complex geometric patterns that looked almost like writing. Pieces of fabric tied to tree branches in colors so faded by weather and time that their original hues were impossible to determine. That first night, I'd attributed the strange atmosphere to my own nerves. I was used to working alone in remote areas, but something about this particular valley made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't explain. The silence was so complete that my own breathing sounded unnaturally loud, and every small noise, the pop of my cooling campfire, the rustle of my sleeping bag, seemed to echo from the surrounding ridges like gunshots. It was around midnight when I first heard the children singing. The sound drifted down from somewhere high on the ridges surrounding the valley, so faint that at first I thought it was just wind in the trees. But as I lay in my tent listening, the sound grew clearer, young voices harmonizing in a melody that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The song had no words that I could make out, just a haunting, wordless tune that seemed to circle the valley like smoke. It reminded me of the shape note singing my grandmother had taught me as a child, the old sacred harp traditions that had been brought to Appalachia by the earliest settlers. But this was different, older somehow, built on intervals that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I'd unzipped my tent and stepped outside, trying to locate the source of the singing. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead in the clean mountain air, but the forest around my campsite was utterly dark. No moon, no ambient light, just the impenetrable black of deep wilderness. The singing seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just from the ridges, but from the forest around me, from the creek itself, as if the entire valley had become a vast musical instrument resonating with that haunting melody. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I'd stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the singing to resume, but the night remained quiet except for the barely audible whisper of the creek. I'd crawled back into my tent and tried to sleep, but the memory of that melody kept echoing in my mind. There had been something wrong with it, something that went beyond simple musical dissonance. It was the kind of sound that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to some primitive part of the brain that still remembered when humans were prey animals hiding from things with better teeth. The second day had brought new discoveries that made me wish I'd never taken this assignment. I'd been following the creek upstream, documenting water quality and looking for signs of the endangered species I was supposed to be cataloging when I'd found the first settlement. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. Not the USGS topographical surveys, not the Forest Service management plans, not even the historical documents that showed the locations of abandoned mining camps and logging operations from the early 1900s. But there it was, nestled in a small side valley maybe 2 miles upstream from my campsite. The ruins of what had once been a substantial community. The buildings were old, constructed in the traditional Appalachian style with hand-hewn logs and stone foundations. But they'd been arranged in patterns that defied the practical considerations that usually governed mountain settlements. Instead of following the natural contours of the land or positioning structures for optimal access to water and transportation, the buildings formed geometric shapes, circles and triangles and more complex figures that looked almost like the symbols I'd seen carved into trees. And in the center of the settlement, where most Appalachian communities would have built a church or meeting house, stood something that made my academic understanding of regional history crumble completely. It was a stone structure, maybe 20 feet tall and perfectly circular, built from blocks of limestone that must have weighed several tons each. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each stone cut and fitted with precision that rivaled anything built by professional stonemasons, joined without mortar in patterns that formed spirals and intersecting geometric designs. But what made the structure truly unsettling were the openings carved into its walls. Not windows or doors in any conventional sense, but perfectly round holes positioned at regular intervals around the circumference. Each opening was exactly the same size, just large enough for a small person to crawl through, just large enough for a child. The interior of the structure was hollow, its walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Spirals that seemed to turn in directions that shouldn't exist, angles that bent in ways that defied three-dimensional geometry. And scattered across the stone floor were objects that made my throat close with horror. Small shoes, dozens of them, ranging from infant booties to the kind of simple leather brogans worn by mountain children a century ago. All of them were stained with something dark that had long since dried to the color of rust. I'd backed out of the structure and immediately tried to call my supervisor on the satellite phone, but the device showed no signal despite the clear sight lines to the sky. According to the GPS, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, following Babel Creek through the Daniel Boone National Forest. But the electronic maps showed no sign of the settlement I was standing in, no indication that this place had ever existed. That's when I'd noticed the children watching me from the forest. They stood just at the edge of visibility among the trees, small figures in clothes that looked like they belonged to different historical periods. Some wore the simple homespun garments of 19th century mountain folk. Others dressed in the overalls and cotton shirts that Appalachian children might have worn in the 1920s or 30s. A few were clothed in styles so old that they might have belonged to the earliest European settlers in these mountains. But they were all wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Not obviously inhuman, but empty in a way that made my primitive brain scream warnings. They had the faces of children, but their expressions were identical. The same hollow smile, the same flat, lifeless eyes, as if they were all sharing the same consciousness. "Hello," one of them called, and its voice carried perfectly across the valley despite the distance. "Are you lost?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something about the way it spoke, the careful pronunciation, the slight delay between words, made my skin crawl. It was as if the child was translating from another language, or trying to remember how human speech was supposed to work. I'd grabbed my pack and started hiking back toward my campsite as quickly as possible, but the forest seemed different now. Trails that should have led back to familiar territory instead wound through areas I didn't recognize, past more ruined settlements and stone structures that weren't on any map. And everywhere I went, I found evidence of the children. Toys made from sticks and leaves, arranged in patterns that looked almost like writing. Small handprints pressed into the mud beside the creek, far too many for any normal population of children. Voices calling from the forest, sometimes in English, sometimes in languages I didn't recognize, always with that same careful, artificial cadence. By afternoon, I'd accepted that I was hopelessly lost in country that shouldn't exist according to any official survey. The GPS showed me moving in circles, but the landmarks I passed were different each time. Different settlements, different stone structures, different arrangements of those disturbing symbols carved into living trees. It was near sunset when I'd found the school. The building sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, a one-room log structure with a stone chimney and windows that had once held glass but now opened onto empty darkness. It looked like thousands of similar buildings that had served rural Appalachian communities in the days before consolidated school districts and bus transportation. But this school was still in session. Through the open windows, I could see them. Dozens of children sitting at rough wooden desks, their hands folded, their faces turned toward a figure standing at the front of the room. The teacher was a woman in a long dress that might have been fashionable a century ago. Her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face pale as bone in the dim light. She was speaking, but her words reached me as a low murmur that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate in my bones. Whatever language she was using, it wasn't English, wasn't any human language I'd ever heard. It was composed of sounds that no human throat should be able to produce, harmonies that followed mathematical principles alien to earthly music. And the children were responding in unison, their voices joining hers in that impossible chorus. Not reciting lessons or singing hymns, but chanting something that made the air itself feel thick and hard to breathe. I tried to back away from the clearing, but my movement must have attracted their attention. The teacher stopped speaking and turned toward the window, her face rotating with the smooth precision of a mechanical device. When she saw me, her mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "We have a visitor," she announced to her class, her voice now carrying clearly across the distance between us. How nice. We so rarely get visitors anymore. The children had turned in their seats to look at me, and I'd seen that their faces were just as empty as those of the figures I'd encountered at the stone structure. But worse than the absence of normal human emotion was the presence of something else, an intelligence that was definitely not childlike, ancient and patient and utterly alien to anything that had ever been young or innocent. "Would you like to join our lesson?" the teacher had asked, stepping toward the window. "We're learning about the old ways. The ways that were here before your people came with their churches and their schools and their foolish ideas about what children should become." I'd run then, crashing through the darkening forest with no destination except away from that impossible classroom and its hollow-eyed students. Behind me, I could hear them singing again. Not the haunting melody I'd heard the night before, but something else. Something that sounded like laughter if laughter could be built from frequencies that made human bone resonate in painful harmonics. The forest had become a maze of trails that led nowhere, clearings that contained more ruins, more stone structures, more evidence of a civilization that had never existed according to any historical record. I'd stumbled through the darkness for hours, following my flashlight beam through a landscape that seemed to shift and change around me. It was near midnight when I'd finally collapsed beside what I hoped was Babel Creek, though the water looked different now, darker, moving with currents that seemed to flow uphill in defiance of gravity. I tried the satellite phone again, but the device now showed error messages in characters I didn't recognize, symbols that hurt to look at directly. That's when they'd found me. The children emerged from the forest like shadows given form. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. all wearing that same empty smile. They moved with perfect coordination, their steps synchronized in ways that no group of normal children could maintain. "You're lost," one of them said, and its voice was echoed by all the others, creating harmonies that seemed to come from the forest itself. "We can help you find your way." "The way to where?" I'd managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. "Home," they'd replied in unison. "To the place where all lost children go. To the place where you can be young forever." They'd started moving closer, and I'd seen that their hands weren't quite right. Fingers too long, joints that bent in too many places, nails that looked more like claws, but their faces remained childlike, innocent, the kind of expressions that should have inspired protection rather than terror. "We've been waiting so long for someone new," one of them continued, speaking for all the others. "Someone to teach our games, someone to learn our songs, someone to help us remember what it was like to be alive." That's when I'd understood what I was really looking at. These weren't children. They had never been children, not in any human sense. They were something else, something that had learned to wear the appearance of youth like a disguise, using the shapes of innocence to hide appetites that were older than human civilization. But they had been children once, I realized with growing horror. The shoes in the stone structure, the handprints by the creek, the voices that carried traces of different historical periods, these things had been collecting children for generations, maybe centuries, adding them to whatever collective consciousness animated their movements. "Don't be afraid," they'd said, reaching toward me with those wrong-jointed hands. "It doesn't hurt, not after the first few days, and then you'll be like us, never hungry, never tired, never alone, never growing old, never having to face the world that adults made." I'd scrambled backward along the creek bank, but there were more of them behind me, emerging from the water like some nightmare baptism gone wrong. They were all around me now, a circle of empty-eyed children whose shadows moved independently of their bodies in the moonlight. "Join us," they'd whispered in voices that harmonized with frequencies that made my vision blur and my equilibrium fail. "Become what you were always meant to be. Become what all children become when the adults aren't watching." The attack, when it came, wasn't violent in any conventional sense. They'd simply touched me, dozens of small hands making contact with my skin, and I'd felt something fundamental begin to drain away. Not blood or life force exactly, but something more essential. The accumulated weight of adult responsibility, the burden of growing up in a world that demanded maturity and compromise, and the slow death of wonder. But also my memories, my identity, everything that made me Travis Coleman instead of just another hollow vessel waiting to be filled with whatever ancient hunger animated these things. I'd fought back with the desperation of someone who finally understood that all the wilderness survival training in the world was useless against threats that didn't follow natural laws. My flashlight had become a club, its beam somehow causing the children to recoil as if light itself was painful to them. But it was my voice that had saved me. Almost without thinking, I'd started singing. Not any planned song, but the first thing that came to mind. "Amazing Grace," in the shape note style my grandmother had taught me, using the old sacred harp harmonies that had echoed through these mountains for over 200 years. The children had screamed. Not the normal cries of hurt or frightened kids, but sounds that belonged to no human throat. Frequencies that shattered the windows of my mind and sent small animals fleeing in terror through the underbrush. They'd released me and backed away, their coordinated movements dissolving into individual panic. The old songs, one of them had hissed, its childish features melting and reforming like wax in candlelight. The songs that bind. The songs that remember. I'd kept singing, following one hymn with another, mixing the sacred harp melodies with half-remembered fragments of the mountain ballads my grandmother had sung while she worked. The children had retreated farther with each verse, their forms becoming less stable, less convincingly human. "This is our place," they'd called from the safety of the forest. "Our valley, our hunting ground. You cannot drive us away with your dead god's music." But their voices were fainter now, less coordinated. Whatever power they drew from their collective consciousness was being disrupted by the old songs, the melodies that carried centuries of human faith and stubborn survival through these mountains. I'd sung until my voice gave out, then hummed the tunes while I gathered my gear and started hiking out of that cursed valley. The trail back to civilization had appeared as if by magic, leading me through forest that looked normal again. Birds singing in the trees, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the natural sounds of a healthy ecosystem. I'd reached my truck just as the sun rose over the eastern ridges, and I'd driven straight to the nearest town without looking back. The Forest Service accepted my report with the professional skepticism reserved for employees who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Babel Creek was resurveyed by a team of 3 biologists who found exactly what they'd expected to find: pristine mountain stream habitat, a few endangered salamander species, no sign of human habitation or unusual activity. The mining company got their permits. The official record shows no settlements in that area, no stone structures, no evidence of the civilization I'd described. My account was attributed to altitude sickness and isolation-induced hallucinations, the kind of psychological episode that could happen to anyone spending extended time alone in remote wilderness. They never found any children. That was 2 years ago. I work for the State Environmental Agency now, cataloging pollution sources and monitoring water quality in areas that are safely suburban. I've never taken another assignment that required camping alone in remote wilderness, and I never will. But some nights, when the wind through the city carries echoes that shouldn't exist in an urban landscape, I hear voices singing, not the hymns and ballads that saved my life, but that other music, the haunting melodies that circle like smoke through valleys that don't appear on any map. And sometimes, in crowded places like shopping malls or schools, I see faces that look too familiar. Children who move with coordination that's just slightly wrong, who smile with expressions that don't quite reach their eyes, who speak with voices that carry harmonics no young throat should be able to produce. Last month, a family camping in the Daniel Boone National Forest reported that their 8-year-old daughter had disappeared during the night. When search teams found her 3 days later, she claimed to have spent the time playing with other children who lived in the forest. She couldn't remember where she'd been, but she'd learned new songs, melodies that made the search dogs whine and refuse to track. The girl was returned to her family, but according to unofficial reports, she's been different since then. Quieter, more focused, less interested in the toys and activities that had occupied her before her disappearance. And she's been teaching the songs to other children. I think the things in Babel Creek are expanding their recruitment, learning to send their collected children into the world beyond the mountains, using them to identify and collect others who might be suitable for their purposes. The old ways are patient. They've been waiting in the deep hollows for centuries, preserving themselves in forms that adults dismiss as folklore and children's games. But they're not content to wait anymore, and I don't think there are enough people left who remember the old songs to hold them back. But there's something else. Something I've been afraid to admit even to myself. Something that happened during those final moments when the children were touching me, draining away everything that made me adult and responsible and safely civilized. For just an instant, I'd felt what they offered. The freedom from adult concerns, from the weight of growing up in a world that demanded compromise and responsibility, and the gradual death of wonder. The chance to remain forever in that magical state where anything seemed possible, where the forest held mysteries that could be explored without fear of mundane explanations. It had been tempting, more than tempting. For that brief moment, it had seemed like the most natural thing in the world to let go of the burden of adulthood and join their eternal childhood, to become part of something larger and more innocent than the complicated mess of adult relationships and career pressures and mortgage payments. The songs had saved me, but they'd also revealed something I didn't want to acknowledge. Part of me had wanted to stay, and I think that part is still back there, in the valley that doesn't appear on any map. Sometimes I dream about it. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid experiences of running through moonlit forests with companions who never grow tired, never grow old, never have to face the disappointing realities that wait beyond childhood. In these dreams, I can hear the old songs playing in reverse, the sacred harp harmonies unraveling into something older and stranger, the mountain ballads revealing verses that were never written down because they predated human language. And when I wake up, I find myself humming melodies I don't remember learning. Not the hymns that drove away the children, but the other songs, the ones they were trying to teach me before the old music interrupted their lesson. I've been researching the history of Babel Creek, digging through archives and genealogical records that most people never see. The valley has a pattern, disappearances stretching back to the earliest European settlement of eastern Kentucky. But it goes back further than that. Cherokee oral histories speak of a place in the mountains where children who died of disease or violence could be found again, playing eternal games in valleys that existed alongside but separate from the normal world. The stories describe these returned children as both blessing and curse, still innocent and loving, but hungry for companionship in ways that eventually consumed entire communities. The early settlers had their own names for such places. Fairy Hollows, they called them, though the fairies they described bore little resemblance to the sanitized versions found in modern children's books. These were older entities, things that remembered when the boundary between childhood and adulthood was more fluid, when coming of age required surviving trials that tested more than just physical endurance. I think the things in Babel Creek are remnants of that older understanding, guardians of a form of childhood that modern civilization can't tolerate. Wild, dangerous, magical in ways that bypass rational thought and speak directly to the parts of the human psyche that never fully mature. And I think they're tired of hiding. The missing children reports are multiplying, not just in Kentucky, but across the Appalachian region and beyond. Kids who disappear from campgrounds and hiking trails, from rural communities where the old ways still hold some influence. Most are eventually found, but they're different when they return. Quieter, more coordinated in their movements, less interested in television and video games, more drawn to outdoor activities that their parents can't quite explain. And they sing. The songs spread through schools and playgrounds like a benign virus, melodies that seem innocent enough but carry harmonics that adult ears can't quite process. Teachers report that their students are more cooperative lately, more focused during lessons, less prone to the individual disruptions that normally characterize childhood behavior. But they're also less creative, less spontaneous, less individually human. I think the collective consciousness that animates the children in Babel Creek is learning to work through existing social structures rather than simply collecting individuals one at a time. Instead of luring children into the deep woods, they're infiltrating the places where children already gather, gradually converting normal kids into extensions of their ancient hunger. And I think I'm supposed to help them. The dreams are getting stronger, more directive. Instead of simply running through moonlit forests, I'm being shown things. Maps of school districts, demographic data about rural communities, behavioral patterns that would help identify children who might be particularly susceptible to the songs. Part of my consciousness is still back in that valley, integrated into whatever collective intelligence guides their activities, and that part is trying to turn me into a recruiting tool, using my adult knowledge and resources to expand their operations beyond the isolated hollows where they've hidden for centuries. I've been fighting it, trying to maintain my individual identity against the pull of that eternal childhood. But the resistance is getting harder every day. Because the truth is, the world they're offering looks better than the one I'm living in. No more environmental reports documenting the slow death of wilderness areas. No more bureaucratic battles over mining permits and development rights. No more watching wild places disappear beneath parking lots and shopping centers. Just eternal play in forests that never change, streams that run clear forever, mountains that exist outside the reach of human progress and its inevitable disappointments. Yesterday, I found myself driving toward the Daniel Boone National Forest without any conscious decision to make the trip. My hands were steady on the wheel, my mind calm and focused, but some deeper part of my consciousness was navigating toward coordinates that didn't appear on any GPS. I turned around before I reached the forest boundary, but the urge is getting stronger. The children are calling me home, and I'm starting to think I should listen. After all, what's the worst that could happen? I'd just be young forever, free from the burdens of adulthood, part of something larger and more innocent than the complicated mess of modern civilization. The old songs are beautiful once you learn to hear them properly. Why don't you come and listen? Why don't you bring the children? They're so eager to play.